Imagine you're walking down a street in the 14th century. You're a baker, maybe, or a stonemason. You've had a good year, you saved up and bought a beautiful new cloak dyed a deep, rich red. You feel proud. But then a city guard stops you. He doesn't ask for your name, he points at your cloak. He tells you that color, scarlet, is only for nobles. The fine for wearing it is more than the cloak cost. You have to take it off right there. Or maybe you're a wealthy merchant's wife planning a wedding for your daughter. You've planned a feast with three main courses, including expensive imported spices and roasted swans. But a law says your social rank is only allowed two courses, and swans are reserved for the king's table. Your whole celebration is illegal. This was the world of sumptuary laws. The name sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. They were laws about what people could own, wear, and consume. The word sumptuary comes from a Latin word, sumptus, which just means expense. These were laws against spending too much money, but it was much deeper than that. They weren't just about balancing a budget, they were about controlling society from the top down. They dictated the details of everyday life for everyone, from the poorest peasant to the richest duke. These rules weren't suggestions. They were the law, and breaking them could lead to fines, public shame, or even jail. At its heart, a sumptuary law was a tool to keep the social order in place. Medieval society was built on a very rigid hierarchy. You had the king at the top, then the high clergy and nobles, then knights, then wealthy merchants, then craftsmen, and finally the vast majority of people, the peasants, at the bottom. Everyone was supposed to know their place, and a big part of knowing your place was looking your place. A farmer shouldn't look like a lord. A shopkeeper's wife shouldn't be mistaken for a duchess. Sumptuary laws made that distinction clear. They were a visual code. By looking at someone's clothes, the color, the fabric, the length of their sleeves, you could tell their social rank almost instantly. It was a uniform for an entire society. These laws weren't a medieval invention. They existed in ancient Greece and Rome. The Romans had rules about who could wear the color purple and how many guests you could have at a dinner party. But they really took off in the high and late Middle Ages from about the 1200s to the 1500s. This was a time of great change. Cities were growing, a new merchant class was becoming wealthy through trade. These were people who weren't born into nobility. They didn't own land or have a title. But they had money, sometimes more money than the local lords. And what do people with new money often want to do? They want to show it off. They want to buy the same fancy clothes and eat the same luxurious food as the aristocrats. This made the old nobility very nervous. Their identity was tied to their visible status. If a wool merchant could dress his family in the same silks and furs as a baron, what made the baron special anymore? It blurred the lines. It threatened the natural order of things, a concept they took very seriously. So kings and city councils started passing laws to put a stop to it. They weren't just trying to be bullies. In their minds, they were protecting the very fabric of society. They believed that if the social order collapsed, chaos would follow. So they legislated everything. They passed laws on the types of fur you could wear. Ermine, with its pure white fur and black-tipped tail, was often reserved for royalty alone. Lesser nobles might be allowed sable or fox, while a merchant might have to settle for rabbit. Peasants got sheepskin or wolf if they were lucky. The laws got incredibly specific. Some English laws from the 14th century dictated the maximum price of cloth a person of a certain income could wear. If you were a servant, your clothes had to be made of cloth that cost less than 2 shillings per yard. If you were a craftsman, you could go a little higher. Only the wealthiest nobles and knights could wear cloth of gold or imported velvet. They even regulated the length of the pointy toes on men's shoes, called polanes. The longer the point, the higher your status. A prince might have points 2 feet long, so long they had to be chained to the knee to walk. A commoner was restricted to a point of just a few inches. It sounds ridiculous to us, but it was a serious status symbol. These laws covered more than just clothing. They governed feasts, limiting the number of dishes served at weddings, funerals, and holidays based on the host's social class. They regulated jewelry, dictating who could wear gold, silver, or precious stones. They could even control the materials used to build a house or the amount of money spent on a child's christening gift. A sumptuary law was a way for the state to reach into your closet, your kitchen, and your wallet. It was a constant reminder woven into the very clothes on your back of exactly where you stood in the great chain of being. It was about making sure nobody got too big for their breeches, literally. So why did governments go to all this trouble? Why did kings and town councils spend so much time writing down rules about sleeve widths and dinner menus? It seems petty to us now, like a kind of medieval fashion police, but to them, these laws were essential. There were three main reasons they kept passing them over and over again: social order, economic protection, and moral righteousness. The biggest reason was social order. The entire medieval world was built on a pyramid structure. God was at the very top. Below him was the king, who ruled by divine right. Then came the great nobles and bishops, followed by lesser lords, knights, merchants, artisans, and at the very bottom, the huge mass of peasants who worked the land. This wasn't just a social structure, it was seen as a reflection of the divine, heavenly order. Each person had a specific place, a role to play. To challenge that was to challenge God's plan. This concept was called the Great Chain of Being. When a wealthy merchant started dressing like a duke, it was more than just a fashion statement. It was an act of social climbing that threatened the whole system. The nobility's power wasn't just in their castles and armies, it was in their prestige, their visible difference from everyone else. If anyone with enough money could look like a noble, then what did it even mean to be a noble? It created confusion. A knight might mistake a clothier for a fellow aristocrat. A peasant might not show proper deference to a person they couldn't immediately identify as their superior. This was deeply unsettling to the ruling class. Sumptuary laws were their way of pushing back. They were drawing bright, clear lines between the classes. The law said, "You are a merchant. You can be rich, but you cannot look like a lord. That right belongs to him by birth, not by wealth." It was a way of making the social hierarchy visible, undeniable, and legally enforceable. The second major reason was economics. Medieval rulers were early practitioners of protectionism. They wanted to keep wealth within their own kingdoms. Luxurious goods like fine silk from the East, high-quality velvet from Italy, or exotic spices from Asia were incredibly expensive. Buying them meant that gold and silver flowed out of the country to foreign traders. A king would look at his wealthy subjects spending fortunes on imported fabrics and see it as a drain on the national treasury. So they passed sumptuary laws to curb this spending. An English law might ban the wearing of foreign-made silk for anyone below the rank of a knight. This had a twofold benefit. First, it kept English money in England. Second, it protected the local wool industry. England was a huge producer of wool, and these laws encouraged people, by force, to buy and wear their own country's products. It was also about preventing personal bankruptcy, especially among the knightly class. Knights were expected to maintain a certain lifestyle. They needed horses, armor, and fine clothes to keep up appearances at court. But many knights were land poor. They had a title, but not a lot of cash. The pressure to compete with the flashy new wealth of merchants was immense. They often went deep into debt trying to look the part. A king needed his knights to be financially stable so they could afford their military equipment and be ready to fight for him. By limiting extravagant spending on clothes and parties, the king was, in a way, trying to protect his military assets from bankrupting themselves over the latest fashion from Paris. Finally, there was a powerful moral and religious dimension to these laws. The medieval church taught that pride was the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. Extravagance, vanity, and showing off your wealth were all seen as expressions of pride. Preachers would deliver fiery sermons against the decadence of modern fashion, calling pointy shoes devil's fingers and elaborate headdresses a sign of moral decay. They saw gluttony in lavish feasts and vanity in expensive clothes. For them, spending a fortune on a new gown while the poor starved was not just bad taste, it was a sin that endangered your immortal soul. Sumptuary laws were a way to turn these moral teachings into state policy. The laws were often filled with language about promoting modesty and humility and discouraging excess and vice. They saw a link between extravagant living and a breakdown of public morality. Rules that limited the number of courses at a meal weren't just about saving money, they were about fighting the sin of gluttony. Rules against fancy clothes were about fighting the sin of pride. For the church and for many pious rulers, these laws were a tool to legislate morality, to try and force their subjects to be more virtuous. They believed that a society that dressed modestly and ate simply was a healthier, more godly society. The laws were an attempt to build a better Christian community by controlling its appetites for food, drink, and fashion. So when you combine the fear of social chaos, the desire for economic stability, and the conviction of religious morality, you can see why medieval leaders thought these laws weren't just a good idea, but an absolute necessity. The actual text of these sumptuary laws can be fascinating because of how specific they were. And lawmakers didn't just say, don't dress too fancy. They went into extreme detail, creating a complex rule book for daily life that covered almost every imaginable luxury. The main targets were clothing, food, and celebrations. Clothing was the most visible and therefore the most heavily regulated aspect of a person's life. It was a walking billboard of your social status. The rules started with color. Dyes in the Middle Ages were expensive and difficult to produce, so the color of your clothes said a lot about your wealth. The most prestigious color was a deep crimson or scarlet. It was made from a tiny insect called the kermes, which had to be harvested by hand from oak trees. It took thousands of them to dye a single garment. As a result, scarlet was usually reserved for high-ranking nobles, royalty, and top church officials like cardinals. The laws in many parts of Europe explicitly forbade anyone below the rank of a knight from wearing it. Another restricted color was Tyrian purple, a legendary dye made from sea snails. It was so ridiculously expensive that by the medieval period it was almost exclusively used by emperors and popes, a direct inheritance from the Roman Empire. For ordinary people, colors were much more subdued. They wore clothes dyed with cheaper, local plants, resulting in shades of brown, yellow, and a pale blue from the woad plant. These were the colors of the working class. Then came the fabrics. The most luxurious materials were silks and velvets, which were often imported from Italy or even farther east. Cloth of gold or silver, fabric literally woven with precious metal threads, was the absolute peak of luxury. These were strictly the domain of the highest royalty and nobility. Laws across Europe, from England to the city-states of Italy, spelled out exactly who could wear these fabrics. Often, only a king, queen, and their immediate family could wear pure cloth of gold. The dukes and earls might be permitted to wear velvet or satin. Below them, a wealthy merchant might be allowed to wear fine wool from Flanders, but not silk. The vast majority of the population wore wool of varying quality. The coarsest, roughest wool, known as homespun, was for peasants. Finer, softer wools were for townspeople and the lower gentry. Linen, made from the flax plant, was used for undergarments by almost everyone, but the quality could range from rough and scratchy to incredibly fine and soft. Furs were another major status marker, especially in the cold climates of northern Europe. The type of fur on the trim of your cloak or lining your winter coat was strictly regulated. At the top was ermine, the winter coat of a stoat. Its pure white fur with the black-tipped tail was a symbol of royalty and purity. It was often forbidden to anyone but the king's family. Next came sable, a dark, rich fur that was almost as prestigious. High-ranking nobles and judges wore sable. Lesser nobles might be allowed fox or marten. Wealthy townspeople, like the mayor or a rich guild master, could perhaps wear beaver or otter. For the common person, it was the fur of common animals, rabbit, squirrel, or even cat. And at the bottom of the ladder, a poor farmer might have a rough cloak lined with unscraped sheepskin. You could tell a person's rank just by the animal on their back. The laws could get even more specific, down to the smallest details of an outfit. In some parts of Italy, laws regulated the number of buttons on a man's tunic. In France, they legislated the width of sleeves. There was a fashion for enormous trailing sleeves that could drag on the floor, and laws were passed to limit their length according to social rank. As mentioned before, the points of shoes were a huge deal. The English court of King Edward IV tried to limit shoe points to 2 inches for anyone who wasn't a lord. These weren't just about stopping excess, they were about freezing fashion in place, ensuring that a certain style remained exclusive to the elite. Beyond clothing, the laws attacked luxury in the kitchen and at the party. Feasting was a central part of medieval social life, a way to display wealth and generosity. But lawmakers saw it as a source of gluttony and wasteful spending. In France, King Philip IV passed a law stating that a duke, count, or baron could have 4 courses at a meal, a knight or prelate could have 3, and a regular gentleman just 2. Certain foods were also restricted. Delicacies like swans, peacocks, and sturgeon were often designated as royal food, forbidden to commoners. The use of expensive imported spices like saffron, cloves, and pepper could also be limited. Weddings and funerals were another major target. People, especially wealthy merchants, would spend astronomical sums on these events to show off. A wedding feast could go on for days. A funeral procession could involve hundreds of paid mourners. Laws were passed to curb this. A city might rule that a bride's dowry could not include more than 1 dress trimmed with fur. They might limit the number of musicians who could play at the wedding or the number of guests who could be invited to the feast. Funeral laws could be just as strict, dictating the quality of the cloth used to cover the coffin and the number of candles that could be burned at the vigil. The goal was to stop these events from becoming competitions in conspicuous consumption, where families would ruin themselves financially just to outdo their neighbors. These nitty-gritty rules show us a world where the government believed it had the right and the duty to control almost every aspect of personal expression, all in the name of order. So they passed all these incredibly detailed laws. The big question is, did anyone actually follow them? The short answer is not really. The history of sumptuary legislation is mostly a history of failure. The very fact that the same laws had to be passed over and over again, often with increasingly harsh penalties, is the best evidence that people were ignoring them. The constant struggle between the lawmakers and the people who wanted to dress and live as they pleased reveals a lot about the tensions in medieval society. Enforcement was the first major problem. How do you police what an entire population is wearing? In some towns, special officials were appointed, sometimes called wardens of apparel or cloth masters. Their job was to patrol the streets and public places, literally inspecting people's clothing. If they found a craftsman wearing silk or a merchant's wife with illegal fur trim, they could issue a fine on the spot. Guilds also played a role. A master of a craft guild might be responsible for making sure his members and their families followed the rules. In some places, parish priests were even encouraged to report on parishioners who showed up to church dressed above their station. The punishments varied. The most common penalty was a fine, which could be very steep, sometimes more than the value of the illegal garment itself. In many cases, the offending item, the purple cloak or the silver buckled belt, would be confiscated. Public humiliation was another powerful tool. A person might be forced to stand in the town square while their crime was announced, a powerful deterrent in a small, close-knit community where reputation was everything. In rare cases for repeat offenders or particularly outrageous violations, imprisonment was a possibility. But people are creative, especially when it comes to status and fashion. They found all sorts of ways to get around the laws. One of the most common tactics was for a wealthy merchant, who was forbidden from wearing certain luxuries himself, to lavish them upon his wife and children. The laws were often less specific about women's and children's dress, creating a loophole. So, the man of the house would dress plainly, in legally approved wool, while his family served as a walking display of his wealth, decked out in silks and velvets. Authorities eventually caught on and passed new laws to close this loophole, specifically targeting the wives of merchants and artisans. Another method was to use materials that looked expensive but weren't technically forbidden. For example, if a law banned cloth of gold, a clever weaver might create a fabric with shiny gilt thread made of a cheaper metal to mimic the look. People would also use huge quantities of a legal, less expensive fabric to create a look of luxury through sheer volume and extravagant tailoring. A woman couldn't wear a dress of silk, but she could have a woolen dress with enormous sleeves and a train so long it required a servant to carry it. The law might not have a rule for that, at least not at first, and of course there was simple defiance. In a big, bustling city like London or Florence, enforcement was bound to be spotty. You might get away with wearing a forbidden item for weeks or months before being caught. For some, the risk was worth the reward of showing off their success. This was especially true for the rising merchant class. They were the engine of the new urban economy, they had the money, they had the ambition, but they were denied the social respect that came with noble birth. For them, breaking sumptuary laws was not just about vanity, it was a form of social protest. It was a way of saying, my money is as good as your title. I have earned the right to wear this. This created a constant cat-and-mouse game. The government would pass a law, the people would find a way around it, and the government would respond with an even more specific, more restrictive law. Ultimately, the laws failed, because they were fighting against powerful forces of social and economic change. You cannot stop the tide with a piece of paper. The new money of the merchant class was reshaping society, and no law about who could wear squirrel fur was going to change that. Fashion itself was becoming a force, changing more rapidly than ever before. By the time a law was passed to ban a certain style of hat, a new, even more outrageous style was already popular. The nobility themselves were often the worst offenders. A king would pass a law restricting luxury, and then show up to a tournament or a feast in a breathtakingly expensive outfit that put everyone else to shame. When the lawmakers themselves don't follow the rules, it's hard to expect anyone else to. The constant need to reissue and revise sumptuary laws is the clearest sign of their ineffectiveness. They were a finger in a dike that was already crumbling. Sumptuary laws didn't disappear overnight. There wasn't a single day when everyone decided they were a bad idea. Instead, they slowly faded away over a few centuries, becoming irrelevant as the world they were designed to control ceased to exist. The decline of these laws was tied to the massive social, economic, and intellectual shifts that marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern world. The social pyramid that these laws were meant to protect was crumbling. The feudal system, based on land ownership and inherited titles, was giving way to a new system based on money and commerce. The Black Death in the mid-14th century had a huge impact. It killed a massive portion of the population, which meant that surviving laborers were in high demand. They could demand better wages and had more social mobility than ever before. The merchant and banking classes in the cities grew more powerful, sometimes bankrolling kings and funding wars. Their economic power began to translate into real political power, and they were less and less willing to be told what to wear by a land-poor baron. The clear lines between classes started to blur, not just in appearance, but in reality. The world was becoming too complex and too fluid for a simple set of clothing rules to manage. The economy was also changing in a fundamental way. The old medieval mindset often saw wealth as a finite pie. If one person got a bigger slice, another had to get a smaller one. Luxury spending was seen as a wasteful vice that drained resources. But the dawn of capitalism brought a new way of thinking. Thinkers like Adam Smith would later argue that spending money, even on luxuries, wasn't a bad thing. It drove demand, created jobs for weavers, tailors, and merchants, and circulated money through the economy. A new consumer culture began to emerge. Instead of trying to restrict spending, governments slowly began to see the benefits of encouraging it. Trade and manufacturing became the engines of national wealth, and telling your most productive citizens they couldn't buy the goods being produced started to seem counterproductive. Intellectual and religious changes also played a huge role. The Renaissance celebrated individual human achievement, and the Protestant Reformation challenged the old religious order. While some reformers like John Calvin in Geneva imposed their own strict sumptuary laws for moral reasons, the broader shift was away from the idea that the state should legislate every aspect of personal life. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on individual liberty and rights, delivered the final blow. The idea that a free person should be able to wear whatever they can afford became a cornerstone of modern thought. The government's job was to protect life and property, not to regulate the length of your coattails. Sumptuary laws began to look like a ridiculous and tyrannical relic of a bygone era. By the 17th and 18th centuries, most of these laws were either officially repealed or had simply fallen into disuse, ignored by everyone. They were a product of a feudal, agrarian world, and they couldn't survive in the new commercial, individualistic one. But does that mean the ideas behind them are completely gone? Not at all. The impulse to regulate appearance and consumption, and to judge people based on what they own, is still very much with us. We just do it in different ways. Think about school uniforms. The justification for them is often that they promote discipline and prevent students from poorer families from being shamed for not having fashionable clothes. That's a modern sumptuary law designed to enforce a kind of social equality instead of a hierarchy. These corporate dress codes do something similar, forcing employees into a uniform look that represents the company's brand rather than their personal status. We also have luxury taxes on expensive items like yachts, private jets, and high-end cars. The official reason is to raise revenue, but it also functions as a way to tax conspicuous consumption, a modern echo of the old moral arguments against extravagance. And even without laws, we live by a powerful set of unwritten social rules. You don't wear a white dress to someone else's wedding. You wear somber colors to a funeral. You dress up for a job interview. These aren't laws, but breaking these codes can have real social and professional consequences. We still use clothing and possessions to signal our identity, our belonging to a certain group, and our status. The difference is that today, the rules are largely set by society, fashion magazines, and social media, not by the king. The laws are gone, but the fundamental human instinct to judge a book by its cover, or a person by their clothes, remains as strong as ever.